Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. Tim and I, PRI Senior Director of Communications, and I chat with PRI Senior Fellow in Business and Economics, Dr. Wayne Winegarden. He joins us to evaluate the response by state and federal governments to boost America's economy amidst the coronavirus pandemic. We discuss a Phase 3, $2 trillion stimulus package enacted by Congress, the long-term consequences of the significant debt increase, how long we should expect the recession to last, and how entrepreneurship can help millions who are suddenly unemployed earn a living from home. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back to PRI's Next Round podcast, Wayne.
Thanks. It's always great to be here.
So let's jump right in with this $2 trillion stimulus package. Give us your overall thoughts. What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? Was it too much, too little? Or did Washington actually have a Goldilocks moment and get it just right?
The package, had necessary components, but the way I think about it really was there's things that we had to do wrapped around things that we could never have done. You can think of that as the toll for the troll that we had to pay. It is far from just right. And there are so many of these kind of Keynesian stimuluses that have been thrown in there that aren't going to help us get through the problems that we have now and are going to create long-term all sorts of costs on taxpayers and the economy down the road. Because what the immediate goal really needs to be, it's not to kind of give checks out in this whole Keynesian stimulus fashion, even if that did work. It really needs to be, how do you float businesses and how do you float families who've lost their jobs so that we can get from now until when the whole pandemic has passed? Because it's a self-imposed shutdown of the economy. And so that's a very different question than what you have with the normal recession or normal kind of downturn. And so even before we get into the idea of whether or not these Keynesian stimuluses work or not, they're just the wrong approach to what we're currently dealing with.
So free marketeers are often wary of government stimulus packages, which historically have been unhelpful and often have done long-term damage to the economy. Contrast this stimulus package with the Obama stimulus in 2009 amidst the financial crisis. And can you offer some comfort to those of us who are fiscal conservatives that this package was the right thing to do?
Yeah, I think there's some comfort in that if you split the package apart, the loans, which there's a lot of problems in terms of getting these loans out initially, and hopefully we'll get past that. But that idea of using the government balance sheet to float loans to keep solvent businesses and solvent kind of families afloat, that's not a fiscal stimulus. That's kind of almost like a central bank policy, and that's why the Fed is part of it, and that has value. Far too much of the stimulus, and that's what we were just talking about. And I love how you put that, the Obama stimulus, because there are so many components of this package that look like that Obama stimulus program that's not going to stimulate the economy normally in this era is going to be completely counterproductive. So these $1,200 checks that we're sending out, one, it's very interesting. You're trying to tell people to spend money at the same time you're saying we're going to close everything down so you can't spend money. But ignore that. You're sending money out to people, many of whom may not have lost their jobs. So the checks aren't addressing the problem that exists. So when you put that kind of nonsensical part of the idea into the more important issue that stimuluses don't stimulate the economy because the money has to come from somewhere. So we're borrowing the money, so we have less money to invest in order to give more consumption to these other groups. That cancels itself out in the short term. And in the long term, what we've done is transferred investment into consumption, and that creates the long-term costs.
So President Trump has his healthcare advisors on one side of the table and his economic advisors on the other. If you were advising President Trump, what conditions do you think would have to happen to give American workers the all clear? When can we go back and open for business?
The virus has to be the primary driver. It's a public health issue, and undoubtedly, when the virus has been under control, whether it's because it's just worked its way through, a vaccine has been developed and is available, treatments are out there. Those latter two are probably much longer, further down the road. We'll get the all clear and in effect the country open for business. And I think that's from a public health perspective, the most important part, but also from an economic perspective. Somebody was, talking to me about when can we go out and expect people to be consuming again, and when will people have faith to go out and go to a restaurant, get on an airplane for travel, for a vacation. And so we need the public health issue and people to have confidence in that before we can see a great deal of consumption and have that return to normalcy. So, because of that economic kind of component to it, as well as obviously the most important, which is the public health component, that's got to be the primary driver of when the country can open for business. And that's why doing the right public health policy, especially from the beginning, was the most important economic stimulus we could have done. If you look at South Korea, which was much more responsive in terms of getting tests out there and in terms of getting the people who were exposed separated out so they didn't have to do these extreme measures. That is the most important lesson that we should take from this, to have better testing up front so you don't have these very economically damaging policies at the back end.
Wayne, unlike most recessions, the economy just fell off the cliff once the mayors and governors of the really most productive regions of the United States started ordering businesses to close. Now, since we had such a hard fall, do you think we will have a V-shaped bounce back when America opens for business? In other words, do you think we're going to have a short or a long recession, or do you think it's too early to tell?
More and more, it's looking like it's going to be what they would call a U-shaped recession, where as opposed to having a sharp bounce back in the economy, things are going to fall and then either kind of continue to gradually decline or flatten out and take a long time to accelerate upward. That's looking like the more likely scenario. I mean, optimistically, we're hoping for a V-shaped, but the longer this persists, the less likely we get a V-shaped bounce back, because the more damage to the economy is being done. If you think about it, this is not exactly the best analogy, but if you think about it as a manufacturing machines, right? And you have the factory shut down. And so the machines, if they can stay well maintained and oiled, and you can turn them back on quickly and get back to work. But if the longer the time, the more the equipment starts to degrade, the longer time it's going to take to, in effect, repair the equipment and get the factory back up to work. And that's kind of what we're dealing with right now. It's the shutdown is looking like 1 month, 2 months, but we're not sure yet. And that delay is going to lead to the infrastructure of the economy to be degraded, and that will extend out the recession to be more U-shaped and less V-shaped.
On top of the $2 trillion stimulus, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin said that he will work with the Fed to inject another $4 trillion into the economy. The Fed balance sheet is now over $5.3 trillion and could be as high as $10 trillion when we finally beat the coronavirus and the economy gets back on track. Talk about the long-term consequences of the Fed carrying all this debt in their books.
Yeah, this is one of the issues that's been hanging around. People haven't been talking about, and now with the crisis and the expansion of all this debt the Fed is carrying, we're really creating a very problematic kind of risk for the economy from monetary policy. Something that I've been following and I'm very concerned about is, since the financial crisis of 2008, the Fed has actually fundamentally changed its operating structure. And George Selgin, who's over at the Cato Institute, he's done fantastic work really explaining how this new structure works, but more importantly, why it's less effective in terms of conducting monetary policy. And so this additional explosion of debt that the Fed is now carrying means that monetary policy is going to be that much less effective, and it's going to be that much harder to actually execute the proper monetary policy. And because of that, I'm just not optimistic, one, that the Fed will fully unwind all of these lending programs and be able to shrink its balance sheet in a timely fashion and in a fashion that doesn't crash the market. And now its portfolio, as it gets into more and more private assets and mortgage-backed securities and local bonds, that now it's really influencing in a political way how credit is allocated. And that's going to make the economy harder to carry and have economic consequences. So there is a much higher risk that errant monetary policy and credit allocation from the Fed is going to create shocks going forward and is going to impact the economy. Once we get past this current crisis, we actually need to turn our attention to that and see how do we get the Fed back to a much more effective operating structure.
Wayne, the other day I was watching the great TV movie on the 2008-09 financial crisis, Too Big to Fail, with William Hurt and Paul Giamatti. And it's, I think, a great history lesson for people to go back and watch when we're talking about these ideas. And one of the things that I was thinking about that's being floated around that movie has kind of been stuck in my brain about is, the discussion of government taking equity positions in companies to help them through the crisis. Now, this must send shivers down your spine, especially considering what we did in 08 and 09. The auto industry comes to mind. Tell us why this would be a very bad idea.
It's just such a bad idea. It's hard to know where to start. By the way, fantastic movie. I need to. You've encouraged me to go rent that now. The most important way of thinking about this is go back to the 1970s, right? And the government, which had nationalized the airline industry and the trains and all of these different industries, and there was all of this deregulation. It began under President Carter and President Reagan. He basically completed that, and we had all sorts of deregulation, and the economy benefited because now there was all sorts of entrepreneurship within these industries, and consumers benefited from, in terms of airlines, better routes, cheaper fares. All sorts of innovation were able to kind of occur because the government was no longer kind of running it as a political institution, which they always do, and that's what the government's supposed to do. And so by taking these equity positions in airlines and who knows what other industries they're going to be looking toward, you're once again taking these industries, these key industries, and instead of having them run based on how do we serve consumers best, they're going to be basically pursuing these political kind of goals. And you already see that with Speaker Pelosi and some of the things that they're talking about. If we take these equity positions in the airlines, on each route, we're going to have them print out how much greenhouse gas emissions were released during that flight. Things that are just antithetical to an efficient operation of an airline. So you're going to take an industry that was contributing to the economy, and long term, it's going to become kind of a detractor. And this is actually, if we go through with this and allow the government to take equity positions in industry, you're going to begin to see our growth potential erode slowly but surely because of those positions.
So millions of people have been furloughed or lost their jobs, and it's unclear whether many of these companies will actually be able to bounce back and rehire these people. A lot of people are finding themselves out of work and are actually shifting to becoming independent contractors, starting their own micro business and making a little bit of money to provide for their families. Talk about your study breaking down barriers to opportunity and making the case that entrepreneurship is essential to help moving people up the economic ladder. What can federal and state policymakers do to make it easier for people to earn a living from home or during these tough times?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's such a good point, Ro, because entrepreneurship is always been the driver of the American economy. I mean, people talk about small businesses and being the heart of the community, right? So there's a huge contribution just in terms of defining what it is to be part of a community to entrepreneurs. They're the ones who've created the internet and created the 21st century economy. And we've had more and more regulations out there that are making it harder and harder for entrepreneurs to succeed. And now that we've come up on the this pandemic and everyone's stuck at home, entrepreneurship is a way where people who have lost a job, they can use those opportunities to earn some money for their families. Whether that's delivering for Amazon and becoming an independent contractor, or all sorts of ways that I'm probably not smart enough to think about that from home they could do via the internet and provide valuable services for their neighbors and in fact earn an income. But you have all sorts of regulations that make it harder, whether it's just the startup costs of getting that business up and running, or things like California, right? We have AB5, where if I wanted to deliver for Amazon, am I an independent contractor, which might make them more likely to hire me, or do I have to become an employee, which creates all sorts of other costs and may make it less likely? That obviously should be between the employee and the company. Rules like AB5 make it that much harder for somebody who's been laid off because of the pandemic to actually find ways to make themselves and their families better better off. So given the gig economy and how all of these new things we never would have thought of in terms of the internet have helped businesses continue, I think we need that same concept for different opportunities for workers and for businesses. And entrepreneurship is just a great way for that to happen.
Wayne, in addition to all the work you do for us on the economy, you're also director of PRI's Center for Medical Economics and Innovation. I don't know where you find the hours in the day to do all of this, but let's take a moment to discuss the economics of healthcare and how it's functioned so far during this pandemic. On the one hand, you've seen masks and protective equipment and coronavirus tests being very slow to get to the market, but yet on the other hand, once industry got moving and red tape got out of the way, you've been seeing industry make up for all of these shortages and in pretty record time. In addition, you're seeing companies working around the clock to develop new treatments and a vaccine. So how would you grade American healthcare overall so far during this pandemic?
I think the healthcare industry has been nothing short of phenomenal. I mean, obviously, the first thing we have to say is the doctors, nurses, health professionals, they deserve our eternal gratitude in being on the front lines. I mean, that's just an incredible success story in terms of their contributions. But if you talk about the pharmaceutical industry, right, they've been moving at lightning speed, right? We now have vaccines in human trials. I mean, that's just phenomenal how fast that occurred. We're also making great progress on discovering a treatment, right? So all of these advances, they demonstrate why we need a vibrant market-based healthcare sector, right? Because they have the resources and the ability to quickly respond to these types of events and hopefully in the very near term move towards vaccines and treatments and get the supplies, the masks, the PPEs, and the respirators to where they need to be. Because while we've seen some parts of the government be very effective, and we have to recognize that that's been helpful, there have been many other parts that have become obstructions and have been blocking our ability to get the respirators to where they need. And on the flip side, the private industry has been moving at lightning speed, and often it's been the red tape from the government which has held them up, right? They've been ready to go and make masks or make respirators, but they can't get the permission to do so. So I think during the pandemic, the private industry has really stepped up and certainly deserves our gratitude as well.
One issue that was exposed during the coronavirus pandemic is how vulnerable the U.S. will be when it comes to the supply of important drugs, much of it coming from China. And, some have argued that this needs to be fixed and going forward, we need to buy America. But free marketeers like ourselves don't want to see a government edict telling companies what to do. How do we achieve an open supply of drugs without the government getting involved?
Well, I think the first thing we have to recognize is it makes no sense to disrupt our current kind of pharmaceutical supply chain in the middle of a pandemic, right? So regardless of where your position is on this issue, whether, we should mandate more being made in the U.S. or not, you don't make a change in the middle of a pandemic. That is just folly. And so I think this is, the fact that we're having this conversation is unfortunate. We have to. People are talking about it. But we shouldn't be having this conversation right now. Once we get past this issue, though, then we have to have kind of a longer-term kind of discussion about the risk to the supply chain. Now, right now, we have a global supply chain for a reason. This arrangement creates a reliable, low-cost drug supply, right? It's inspected by the FDA, and it's benefiting millions of Americans, right? If we were to create a Made in America edict and forced all drugs to be made in the U.S., right? One, that'd be a huge disruption to the supply chain. We would have shortages of drugs in the near term. You would also create all sorts of problems in terms of responses by our trading partners, and additional costs would come from that. But in the near term, we would see costs of drugs increasing in the U.S. So at a time where we're worried about drug costs being too high, this Buy America mandate is actually going to make things worse for patients in the U.S. in the long term. Now, there are actions that we can take in terms of incenting more domestic production. And one idea that was floated by Avik Roy over at Forbes is he said, if we restored the previous federal tax treatment for firms that were operating in U.S. territories like Puerto Rico, what you actually had is because of that tax treatment, it was very profitable to produce pharmaceuticals in Puerto Rico, right? It made sense, and Puerto Rico was a major supplier. We changed the tax laws. It was no longer profitable, and production left the island. So if we were to restore that tax treatment, instead of creating a negative incentive, right, and disrupting the supply chain, creating trade tensions, all sorts of negatives, through a positive, right, where we have kind of favorable tax treatment on territories in the U.S., we would be inducing, kind of incenting production in the U.S. At the same time, prices for consumers wouldn't be increasing, and we would be improving the economy of Puerto Rico. So I think there are changes that we can make that would encourage or a change in the supply. But the bottom line is we have a safe, reliable drug supply right now. We don't want to mess that up by, these Buy American mandates. And we don't want to have to deal with all of the trade costs and the other negatives for the economy. And when you talk about the pandemic and the current kind of weakness in the economy we're already experiencing, these costs are certainly more folly that we just don't need.
So, Wayne, the ink is barely dry on the Phase 3 stimulus plan, and now you're seeing Republicans and Democrats already clamoring for some sort of Phase 4 stimulus, and we've heard people talk about Phase 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, too. So you're seeing Republican leaders pushing to replenish the Small Business Loan Fund, which is, as of when we're taping this now, has been nearly completely exhausted. Speaker Pelosi is pushing for as much as $500 billion, I read, in additional spending, including the small business part. President Trump has talked about a big infrastructure deal. AOC is still pushing for the Green New Deal as part of a Phase 4. And then you've seen Governor Newsom here in California writing to his quote-unquote Aunt Nancy, pushing for $1 trillion fund for state and local governments. So what do you make of these various plans that are being floated? Should we even have a Phase 4 stimulus? And if we should, what should be in it?
That's such an important question. And when you talk about, I guess directly to the question, should we even have a Phase 4 stimulus? We shouldn't. The program for small businesses, as that's running out of money, I think there's logic to ensuring there's enough funds to perform that essential function of using the government balance sheet to help float small businesses and help float the people who are struggling because of unemployment due to the coronavirus. And that really needs to be the essential part of what they're doing. What's happening on top of that, and that's where the Phase 4, 5, 6 stimulus packages keep coming in, is they're using this crisis as an excuse to get their favorite packages out there, to redesign government, to grow government, to get the Green New Deal done. And all of those are bad policy, but more to the point, it's not the issue at hand that we're dealing with. And so they're doing that famous Rahm Emanuel quote where you're not letting a good crisis go to waste. And that's a real shame, because all of these programs are just imposing excessive costs that we're going to have to deal with for years to come. And that the recession that is already in sight. The retail sales data has come out as of our recording, and you saw almost a 9% drop in retail sales. It's a continuation of these unprecedented economic collapse and the evidence of this unprecedented collapse. All of these wasteful expenditures aren't going to help. So, no, we don't need a new stimulus package that spends more money unwisely, puts us more in debt. To the extent that the small business loans, that's part of the essential helping businesses float using the government balance sheet to help businesses float from the crisis to over the crisis. If that's running out of money, we could reallocate the money that's already been passed by the government, right? And not spend more money, which is not going to be effective, not going to be spent in a timely manner, and just adding to our debt. So programs that do matter focus more on transferring resources away from the wasteful projects and focusing on actually helping the people and the businesses that are harmed by this pandemic. It takes a very long time to spend money out of the federal government. Most of the funds have not been spent, will not be spent in a timely manner. And so to say we need more money and allocate more money that'll be spent even further down the road in this rushed manner that's not focused on improving the necessary components of the economy is just a complete waste. And that goes for the infrastructure programs as well, where there are certainly valuable infrastructure projects to be done. It just shouldn't be decided in this rushed manner. It should be decided on which projects add value and done in a very thoughtful manner. And that's just not the way they're spending money now.
Finally, let's talk about the world beyond the coronavirus. In fighting the virus, we could be seeing a debt as high as $30 trillion. You authored a series called Beyond the New Normal. What from your study can we do going forward so that we can begin to reduce the debt, shrink government, and have a vibrant economy in a post-coronavirus world.
In the Beyond the New Normal, which I actually really love that study because I feel like it provides kind of a roadmap in terms of where we need to go long term. And in terms of the government share of the economy, we try to define what is an affordable amount of government spending, which given how much we're spending now and $30 trillion of debt, that's, I think, a very important question. How much can we really afford? And if your goal is to maximize growth, really what we can afford is about 15% of our income. And what you're talking about now is 36% of our income. And after all of this new debt, we're going to go up to about 46% of the economy. So you're talking about half the economy is now being sucked up by government spending. And this long-term doesn't even include all of the unfunded pension liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, all of these entitlements that we've promised to spend, nor does it include the $2 trillion infrastructure programs that we were just talking about that might become part of phase 4. So going forward, we are putting on ourselves an untenable situation where we cannot afford the level of government that is developing. So, give me a question is, what do we do? I think the first thing we need to do is make sure that every last stimulus program is ended as quickly as possible, right? We've jumped up, good 5-10 percentage points of government as a share of our economy, right? A lot of those are temporary, but we need to make sure they are temporary, right? What did President Reagan say? There's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program. We need to violate that saying and actually get that spending so it is just a temporary blip in our fiscal house. And then it's time, it's been past time, but we need to get our fiscal house in order. We need to not have trillion-dollar deficits when the economy is strong and there's no crisis. I mean, that is just fiscal. You almost, I was going to say malfeasance, but that might be too strong of a word. That's why I paused. But it certainly is the wrong thing to be doing, bad for the economy and bad for kind of future generations. And then we need to go through real spending reform, where we're actually working toward a real budget on government spending, right? Where we set a cap and then we prioritize spending on everything, whether it's defense, whether it's Medicare, entitlements. We need to prioritize spending across all the programs and then move on to the very important issue of entitlement reform. Because until we get Social Security, Medicare on solid footing, we won't get our fiscal house in order.
Thanks so much, Wayne. Appreciate all the great information.
Oh, thanks so much.
Special thanks to Wayne Winegarden and to Tim Anaya. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.